I didn't expect you to become a thought I couldn't finish. That's the strange part. Not that you appeared. People appear all the time. They enter your attention, occupy a little space, leave an impression, and eventually become part of the background again. That's normal. That's how most connections work. They arrive with a beginning, move through a period of familiarity, and eventually settle into a shape that can be understood. I know how to let people become understandable. I know how to place them. I know how to recognize what they mean to me, what they don't mean, where they belong, and how much space they should occupy. I've always been good at that. Maybe too good. Because knowing where something belongs gives you control over it. And control has always been easier for me than uncertainty. Until you didn't become important all at once. There was no dramatic moment, no single conversation that changed everything, no obvious turning point where I could point backward and say, there, that was when it started. It wasn't like that. It happened in fragments, small things, almost insignificant things, a sentence here, a pause there, a reaction that stayed in my mind longer than it should have, a moment where you understood something without asking me to explain it, a silence that somehow felt more complete than a conversation. None of those things should have mattered. Individually, they meant almost nothing. But together, they created a pattern, and once I saw the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. That's what unsettles me. Not that you affected me, but that you did it without trying. There was no strategy behind it, no attempt to get closer, no deliberate effort to become important. You simply existed as yourself. And somehow, that was enough. Maybe that's why I noticed you, because most people approach you carrying an intention. They want something, attention, vulvilation, understanding, closeness, recognition. Even when they don't say it, you can feel the direction behind their behavior. There's usually a destination. With you, there wasn't. You weren't trying to arrive anywhere. You were simply present, and somehow, that made your presence impossible to ignore. I think that was the first thing that changed. I started noticing you without meaning to. Not because I was looking for you, because my mind began making room for you before I consciously decided to. That difference matters. When you choose to think about someone, there is intention. When someone begins appearing in your thoughts without invitation, there is something else happening, something deeper, something your conscious mind didn't authorize. I would catch myself remembering something you said hours later. Not the whole conversations, just one sentence, sometimes not even the sentence, just the way you said it, the timing, the expression behind it, the strange accuracy of something you noticed. And I would wonder why it stayed, why that particular moment, why that particular detail. Why did my mind preserve something so ordinary? I tried to dismiss it. I told myself it was nothing. Attention does that, sometimes. The mind attaches meaning where there isn't any. People become interesting simply because we notice them repeatedly. I knew all the explanations. I could give myself 10 of them. And for a while, I believed them. Then you kept appearing, not physically, mentally, in the spaces where I normally had complete control, and eventually I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't trying to understand you anymore. I was trying to understand why I understood you. There's a difference, a significant one. Understanding someone means observing them. Understanding why you recognize someone means looking at yourself. And that's where this became dangerous. Because I don't like looking at the parts of myself that don't have clear explanations. I prefer things I can name. I prefer patterns that have causes. I prefer emotions that can be traced back to something. I prefer reactions that make sense. But you created reactions without obvious causes, and that bothered me. Not because they were negative, because they were precise. You would say something, and something in me would immediately settle, not excitement, not nervousness, not the usual intensity people associate with connection. Something quieter, something almost like recognition, like hearing a sentence in a language you didn't realize you knew. That's the closest description I have. You didn't feel unfamiliar. You felt untranslated. And I didn't know what to do with that, because unfamiliarity is easy. You can study it. You can observe it. You can create distance from it until it becomes understandable. But familiarity without history? That's different. It has no logical foundation. There's no shared past to explain it, no years of knowing each other, no long collection of memories, no gradual development that makes the feeling reasonable. And yet there was something about you that felt strangely easy to recognize. Not your entire personality, not every detail, something underneath it. The way you processed things, the way you responded, the way you could sit with uncertainty without immediately trying to eliminate it. The way you seemed to notice what existed between words rather than only the words themselves. That was familiar, too familiar. And I began wondering whether maybe that was the real connection, not similarity, recognition. Two people don't always connect because they are alike. Sometimes they connect because they understand the same invisible language, the language of pauses, the language of restraint, the language of things that are deliberately left unsaid, the language of noticing without announcing that you noticed. I think that's where you reached me, not through what you said, through what you didn't force me to say. That distinction is important. Most people want access. They want explanations. They ask questions because they believe every closed door exists to be opened. They want to know what you're thinking, what you feel, why you reacted, why you went quiet, why you changed your tone. And when you don't answer, they interpret the silence as rejection. You didn't. You allowed silence to remain silence. And somehow that made me feel more understood than any question could have, because you didn't demand evidence of what I was feeling. You didn't require me to translate myself into something convenient. You didn't make my quietness responsible for your comfort. You simply allowed it to exist. That sounds small. It isn't. There are people who spend years around you and never learn how to leave a silence untouched. They constantly fill it, explain it, repair it, control it. You didn't. You trusted the space. And maybe I noticed, because I've spent so much of my life protecting my own. I've always believed that distance is a form of protection. Not because people are dangerous, because interpretation is. People rarely leave you as you are. They see a part of you and construct the rest. They take what they understand and use it to explain what they don't. And suddenly you become their version of yourself. Their assumptions become your identity in their mind. I learned a long time ago that the safest way to avoid being misunderstood is to remain partially unread. Give people enough to interact with, never enough to reconstruct you completely. It works, it keeps things clean, it prevents unnecessary expectations. It allows you to move through relationships without giving anyone the ability to define you. But then you came along, and somehow, being unreadable stopped working. Not because you decoded me, because you didn't try. You didn't solve me. You simply noticed me. There's something almost unsettling about being seen by someone who isn't trying to see you. It feels accidental, and therefore more honest. You weren't searching for hidden meanings. You weren't trying to prove that you understood me. You just responded to what was actually there. And sometimes your responses were so accurate that I found myself wondering how you knew. I never told you. I never explained it. And yet you somehow touched the exact place without needing directions. That doesn't happen often. At least not to me. So I started paying attention. More than I should have. I started remembering things, the small details, the way you phrase certain thoughts, the things you ignore, the things you notice immediately, the moments when you become quieter, the moments when your words become lighter because you're hiding something heavier underneath them. I noticed. And the strange thing is, noticing you didn't feel like work. It felt natural. That frightened me more than anything else because attention can be controlled, fascination can fade, curiosity can be satisfied. But natural recognition, that has no obvious endpoint, there's always another layer, another detail, another moment that makes you think, I know that, I understand that, I felt that too. And suddenly, the person in front of you stops being merely someone you interact with. They become a reference point. You begin carrying their perspective into places where they aren't present. That happened to me. Quickly, gradually. And I didn't realize it until one day I caught myself thinking about what you would notice. Not what you would say. What you would notice. That was different. It meant your presence had moved from conversation into perception. You weren't just part of my interactions anymore. You were becoming part of the way I looked at things. And I didn't like how significant that realization was, because influence is one thing. Influence can be rejected. You can disagree with someone. You can create distance. You can tell yourself their opinion doesn't matter. But when someone becomes part of your internal reference system, distance doesn't erase them. You can stop speaking. You can stop seeing them. You can stop mentioning them, but their perspective remains, and suddenly you realize they've changed the questions you ask yourself. That's what you did. You changed the questions. Before you, I was mostly concerned with whether something made sense. After you, I started wondering whether it felt honest. Before you, I measured things by consistency. After you, I started measuring them by depth. Before you, silence was simply the absence of communication. After you, silence became information. That is not something I consciously chose. It happened, and that's why I can't pretend it didn't. I could call it imagination. I could call it projection. I could say that I assigned meaning to ordinary moments. Maybe some of that is true. Maybe the mind always participates in the creation of significance. But even if I remove every assumption, something remains. The fact that I changed, that part is undeniable. Whatever this is between us, it has already had an effect. And effects matter more than explanations. You can debate why something happened. You can question what caused it. But once something changes you, the change itself becomes real. That's where I am now. Not trying to decide whether you matter. You do. The question is how. And that question is harder. Because there are forms of importance that don't fit into ordinary categories. Someone can matter because you love them, because you need them, because you admire them, because you fear losing them, because they make you feel understood. But what happens when someone matters because they make you see yourself differently? What do you call that? I don't know. Maybe it doesn't need a name. Maybe names are sometimes just containers we create because uncertainty makes us uncomfortable. We label things so we can stop thinking about them. Friendship, love, attachment, fascination, décence, chemistry, understanding. Every label carries assumptions. And maybe this is too precise to fit inside one. Maybe that's why I keep refusing to name it. Not because I'm afraid of what it is, because I'm afraid that naming it will make me smaller than the experience. Some things lose accuracy when you simplify them, and I don't want to simplify this. Not anymore. I've spent too much time observing it, too much time understanding what it has changed, too much time noticing how naturally you have become part of my internal world. I don't want to reduce all of that to a single word simply because a word would make it easier to explain. I'd rather admit that I don't have a perfect name for it, but I know it exists. That should be enough. Maybe that's the real lesson you brought into my life. Not everything meaningful needs immediate definition. Some things need to be experienced before they can be understood. And perhaps I've been trying to understand this too quickly. Perhaps I've been treating uncertainty like a problem when it might actually be part of the experience. You didn't arrive with answers. You arrived with questions. Questions I didn't know I had. Questions about closeness, about trust, about recognition, about why some people feel familiar before they become known, about why certain conversations stay with you long after they end, about why a person you barely expected to notice can somehow become part of the architecture of your thoughts. Architecture. That's the word that keeps returning, because this doesn't feel temporary anymore. It feels built into something, not into my life externally, into the way I process it internally. There are thoughts I have now that wouldn't have existed in the same form before you. There are things I notice because I know you would notice them. There are moments where I instinctively imagine how you might interpret something. And sometimes I disagree with that imagined interpretation. Sometimes I challenge it. Sometimes I realize I was wrong. But the fact that I consider it at all tells me something. Your perspective has become a second angle through which I examine my own. That is influence, not control, not dependence. Influence. And I respect the difference because I don't want to lose myself inside another person. I never have. I don't want someone to become the center of my existence. I don't want my identity to depend on their attention. That isn't connection. That's disappearance. And I don't want to disappear. If anything, the strange thing about you is that I feel more aware of myself, more precise, more honest. You didn't make me smaller. You made certain hidden parts of me visible. And perhaps that's why your presence feels so significant, because I don't feel consumed by it. I feel clarified by it. There is a difference. A person can overwhelm you without understanding you. A person can excite you without seeing you. A person can need you without knowing you. But to make someone more aware of themselves simply by existing near them, that is rare. And I don't think rarity should be confused with destiny. I'm not going to pretend that every unusual connection is automatically meant to become something permanent. Life doesn't work that way. Sometimes people enter your world to change something and leave. Sometimes they stay. Sometimes they become a chapter. Sometimes they become a sentence you remember for years. And sometimes they become part of the way you understand an entire period of your life. I don't know which one you are. That uncertainty remains. But I no longer feel the need to eliminate it, because uncertainty doesn't make something meaningless. Sometimes uncertainty is simply proof that the story hasn't finished revealing itself, and ours, Hasn't, that's what I know, it hasn't finished. There are still things I don't understand. There are still parts of you I haven't seen. There are still things you haven't said. There are still spaces between us that haven't been crossed, and perhaps they shouldn't be crossed too quickly. Maybe some things need room. Maybe closeness isn't measured by how quickly you eliminate distance. Maybe it's measured by whether the distance can exist without becoming a threat. That's something I've learned from you. You never made distance feel like rejection. And because of that, I stopped seeing closeness as something that had to be constantly proven. That changed something in me. I used to think that if someone mattered, their presence had to be obvious. Now I understand that some of the deepest connections are almost invisible from the outside. Two people can exchange a few words and carry the weight of an entire conversation beneath them. Two people can sit in silence and somehow say more than others say in an hour. Two people can know very little about each other's history and still recognize something fundamental. That doesn't make the connection supernatural. It makes it human, deeply human. Because humans recognize patterns, we recognize ourselves in others. We recognize wounds. We recognize restraint. We recognize ways of thinking. We recognize the things we never learned to explain. Maybe that's what happened. Maybe I recognized something in you that already existed in me. And instead of creating a new part of myself, you illuminated an old one. That possibility makes more sense than anything else, because you didn't transform me into someone different. You revealed someone I had already been. That's why this feels less like becoming and more like remembering. Remembering something I had forgotten I knew. Remembering what it feels like to be understood without having to perform. Remembering that not every relationship has to be managed. Remembering that sometimes another person can simply be present without becoming a problem to solve. And maybe that's why I trust the silence between us. Not because I know where it leads, because I know it doesn't need to lead anywhere immediately. That realization has given me a strange kind of peace. Not certainty, peace. There's a difference. Certainty says, I know what happens next. Peace says, I can survive not knowing, and perhaps I've been confusing the two for years. I kept trying to know everything before allowing myself to feel anything. I kept demanding explanations before accepting experiences. I kept trying to predict outcomes before allowing moments to exist. You made that strategy less effective, not by challenging it, by making it unnecessary. You didn't ask me to surrender control. You simply gave me something that control couldn't improve, and that forced me to recognize its limits. Control can protect you from chaos, but it can also protect you from possibility. You can become so good at preventing disappointment that you also prevent surprise. You can become so careful about who gets close that you eventually forget what genuine closeness feels like. I don't want that anymore. Not because I'm suddenly fearless. I'm not. I still notice the risks. I still recognize the possibility of misunderstanding. I still understand that people change. I still know that connections can end. But I no longer believe that the possibility of loss makes something not worth experiencing. That's new for me. And you are part of the reason. Not because you promised permanence. You didn't. Not because you guaranteed anything. You couldn't. But because your presence showed me that something can matter without being guaranteed. That is a difficult truth. Maybe the most difficult one. We want guarantees before we invest. We want certainty before vulnerability. We want promises before trust. But real life rarely gives those things in the correct order. Sometimes you understand first, then you risk, then you discover whether the connection can survive reality. And perhaps that is where I am now, at the edge of understanding, not the edge of certainty. There's still a difference. I understand what you have changed. I understand why your presence matters. I understand why I notice you. I understand why certain moments remain, but I don't know what this becomes. And I think I'm finally okay with that, because maybe the point was never to predict the ending. Maybe the point was to stop pretending the beginning didn't matter. And the beginning mattered more than I expected, more than I allowed myself to admit. It began with noticing, then recognition, then curiosity, then something quieter, something that didn't have a name, and somewhere along the way, you became familiar. Not familiar, because I know everything about you. Familiar because some part of you makes sense to some part of me. That is different, and perhaps that difference is everything. I don't want to turn this into a fantasy. I don't want to invent things you never said. I don't want to create a version of you that exists only because I needed one. That would be unfair to you and dishonest to me. If anything is going to exist here, I want it to exist in reality, in what you actually say, in what you actually do, in what we actually understand, not in assumptions, not in projections, not in imagined promises. That matters to me because the more significant something becomes, the more careful you should be with it. I don't want intensity to replace truth. I don't want imagination to replace communication. I don't want possibility to replace reality. I want to know what is actually there, even if the answer is complicated, even if the answer changes, even if the answer isn't what I hoped. Because something real deserves honesty more than it deserves comfort. And if I'm honest, that's what I've been avoiding, not you. Honesty, the honesty that says you matter, the honesty that says your presence has changed me, the honesty that says I notice your absence, the honesty that says certain moments with you stay longer than they should, the honesty that says I don't fully understand why. And maybe I don't need to. Maybe saying that is enough. You matter. You changed something. I noticed. I'm still noticing. And I don't know where it goes from here. There is something strangely freeing about admitting that. Because for so long I thought every truth needed a conclusion. Now I think some truths simply need acknowledgement. You can acknowledge something without controlling it. You can appreciate something without possessing it. You can care without demanding. You can feel without immediately turning the feeling into a decision. That might be the balance I've been missing. I kept thinking the only options were distance or complete closeness, either protect myself or surrender myself. But there is another option: presence. Stay present. Pay attention. Let reality reveal itself. That feels healthier, more honest, more like me. Because I don't want to become someone reckless just because something feels rare, and I don't want to become someone cold just because something feels important. I want to remain myself, only more honest than before. And maybe that is what you have given me. Not a new identity, dapper Fenson to stop hiding behind the old one. There are parts of myself I've kept carefully separated from everyone. Not because they were shameful, because they were delicate. Some thoughts don't survive being misunderstood. Some feelings become distorted when you explain them to the wrong person. Some truths lose their shape when they are forced into language before they are ready. You somehow made those parts feel less dangerous, not because you promised to protect them, because you didn't reach for them. You allowed them to come forward naturally. And that matters. The safest person isn't always the one who promises they'll never hurt you. Sometimes it's the person who doesn't demand access to places you haven't opened. That kind of restraint is rare, and I noticed it. Of course I noticed it. I notice everything. But with you, noticing stopped being surveillance. It became appreciation. That's another difference. I used to observe people to protect myself. With you, I started observing because I wanted to understand. That shift says more than anything else. It means fear stopped being the primary reason I was paying attention. Curiosity became something else, something warmer, something quieter, something I didn't immediately reject. And that is probably why this has lasted. Because I didn't have to force it. Neither did you. There was no constant maintenance, no performance, no attempt to keep the connection alive through artificial intensity. It existed in ordinary moments. That's what made it convincing. Real things often become visible in ordinary moments, not in dramatic declarations, not in perfect circumstances, in the little things, the way someone responds when they are tired, the way they behave when they disagree, the way they treat silence, the way they react when they don't understand, the way they respect boundaries, the way they notice something without making you feel exposed. That is where people reveal themselves. And I kept seeing something in you that I respected, something steady, something I didn't have to convince myself to trust. Trust didn't arrive as a decision. It accumulated slowly, almost invisibly. And one day I realized I wasn't questioning it anymore. That surprised me, because trust is not easy for me. I don't give it because someone asks. I don't give it because someone is kind. I don't give it because someone says the right things. Trust comes from consistency, from what remains true when nothing is being gained. And you were consistent, not perfect, not predictable, just real. There's a difference. Predictability can be performed. Reality is harder to fake, and I think I recognize that. Maybe that is why the connection feels grounded, despite how unusual it is. It isn't built entirely on imagination. It has evidence, small evidence, repeated evidence, enough to make me pay attention, enough to make me stay, enough to make me wonder what happens if I stop trying to control the answer. That question still scares me. What happens if I let something matter without knowing how it ends? What happens if I stop measuring every step? What happens if I stop protecting myself from a future that hasn't happened? Maybe I discover something. Maybe I lose something. Maybe nothing changes externally at all. But internally, something already has, and that is impossible to undo. You have already become part of my understanding. I can't unlearn what I've learned. I can't unsee what I've seen. I can't return to the exact version of myself who didn't know what this kind of recognition felt like. That version of me is gone, not destroyed, just expanded. And perhaps that is what meaningful people do. They don't always stay, they don't always become permanent, but they expand the boundaries of who you are capable of being. They show you a room inside yourself you didn't know existed. And once you've seen that room, you can't pretend the house is smaller than it is. You did that. You showed me something. Not about you, about me. And maybe that is why I cannot reduce this to attraction, curiosity, friendship, or anything else, because the real effect was internal. You changed the way I relate to myself. You made me question the parts of me I thought were permanent. You made me realize that being understood doesn't necessarily mean being exposed. You made me realize that closeness doesn't always mean losing independence. You made me realize that uncertainty doesn't automatically mean danger. And you made me realize that some people can enter your world without trying to own a piece of it. That last one matters, because I don't want ownership. I don't want control. I don't want someone to become responsible for my happiness. I want something much simpler. Truth, if we are here, let it be real. If we understand each other, let it be because we actually do. If we matter to each other, let that be discovered rather than manufactured. If there is distance, let it be respected. If there is closeness, let it be honest. I don't need promises that reality cannot guarantee. I need consistency. I need truth. I need the freedom to remain myself while allowing someone else to matter. And perhaps that is the only kind of connection worth keeping, one where neither person has to disappear for the other to feel close, one where silence isn't punishment, where space isn't abandonment, where vulnerability isn't weakness, where understanding doesn't become control, where caring doesn't become possession, where two people can remain completely themselves and still somehow meet in the middle. That is what I want to believe this can be. Not because I need it to become something, because I respect what it already is. And maybe that is enough for now. I don't need to rush the meaning. I don't need to force the next chapter. I don't need to create a future before the present has finished speaking. For once, I can simply listen. Listen to what exists. Listen to what changes. Listen to what remains. And if you remain too, then perhaps that will tell me more than any promise could, because people reveal their intentions over time. They reveal their sincerity through consistency. They reveal their importance through absence. They reveal their place in your life through what remains after the excitement disappears. And whatever this is between us has already survived the first thing most connections depend on: novelty. It didn't disappear when the newness faded. It became quieter and somehow deeper. That matters, because excitement can be temporary. Curiosity can be temporary. Fascination can be temporary. But quiet recognition, that tends to stay. It doesn't demand attention. It waits, and maybe that's why I still feel it. Even when we aren't speaking. Even when the day is full. Even when something else occupies my attention. There's still a small awareness somewhere beneath everything. You exist not as an interruption, not as an obsession, as a fact. And perhaps that is the most honest way I can describe it. You became part of my internal landscape, not the entire landscape, not the center. Just a place I now know exists. A place I didn't know was there before, and I don't need to erase it. I don't need to worship it either. I can simply acknowledge it. That feels mature. That feels real. And maybe real is better than intense. Maybe depth doesn't need drama. Maybe meaningful doesn't need to be overwhelming. Maybe the strongest connections are the ones that make you quieter instead of louder, the ones that make you more honest instead of more desperate, the ones that make you more yourself instead of less. That is what I feel when I think about you. Not chaos, clarity, not urgency, awareness, not possession, respect. And maybe that is why I'm still here, because whatever this is, it hasn't asked me to become someone else. It has only asked me to stop pretending I haven't changed. That is a request I can finally accept. I have changed. I notice differently. I listen differently. I understand differently. I allow silence to exist differently. I question myself differently. And somewhere inside all of those changes is your presence, not as an explanation, as a reference, a reminder that sometimes another person can reach you without trying to. Sometimes someone can matter before you have a reason for them to. Sometimes the mind recognizes something before language catches up. And sometimes the most honest thing you can say is simply, I don't know exactly what this is, but I know it is not nothing. I know it has affected me. I know it has made me look closer. I know it has made me question things I thought were settled. I know it has made me more aware of what I allow into my life. And I know that when I think about what comes next, I no longer imagine only my own perspective. Somewhere in that thought, yours exists too. Not because I cannot think without you, because knowing you has changed what thinking means to me. That is different. That is important. And maybe, eventually, I'll understand exactly what place this has in my life. Maybe one day the uncertainty will become a clear answer. Maybe it won't. But I'm no longer afraid of that, because I've finally understood something I should have known much earlier. Not every meaningful thing arrives with certainty. Some things arrive with recognition. Some things arrive quietly. Some things don't announce that they are changing you until you look back and realize you are no longer standing where you started. That is what happened. I looked back, and you were there, not at the beginning, not as the cause of everything, but somewhere along the way, you became part of the distance between who I was and who I am now. And I can't pretend that doesn't matter. I don't want to, because maybe pretending would be easier, but easier has never been the same thing as better. And this time, I don't want the easier answer. I want the honest one. The honest answer is that you reached me, not loudly, not dramatically, not by forcing your way through every wall I built. You simply stayed real long enough for me to stop needing the walls. And that may be the most unexpected thing of all. I thought being understood required explanation. You taught me that sometimes it requires attention. I thought trust required time. You taught me that time matters, but consistency matters too. I thought closeness required constant presence. You taught me that some people remain present even when they are quiet. I thought vulnerability meant giving someone access. You taught me that sometimes vulnerability is simply allowing yourself to be seen without immediately hiding again. And perhaps that is where I am now. Not completely open, not completely guarded, just honest. Honest enough to admit that you matter. Honest enough to admit that I don't know what happens next. Honest enough to let the next part unfold without trying to control every detail. Because maybe the future doesn't need to be forced. Maybe it needs to be discovered. One conversation at a time, one silence at a time, one truth at a time. And if we continue to meet each other with the same honesty that brought us here, perhaps whatever this is will reveal itself naturally. And if it changes, then we will know. If it deepens, we will know. If it becomes something neither of us expected, we will know. If it eventually becomes a memory, even then, it will have been real. And that is enough. Because not everything meaningful is measured by how long it lasts. Sometimes it is measured by how deeply it changes you while it exists. You already did that. You already changed something. You already became part of a version of me that didn't exist before. And maybe that is why I no longer want to ask whether I should have let you get this close. The question feels too late. You are already here, not physically, not necessarily permanently, but somewhere deeper, somewhere in the way I think, somewhere in the way I notice, somewhere in the way I understand silence, Somewhere in the way I recognize sincerity. Somewhere in the way I now understand that another person can matter without becoming a threat to your independence. You are there, and I don't need to remove you. I don't need to exaggerate you. I don't need to define you. I just need to be honest about the space you occupy. It exists. And for now, that is enough. Maybe one day we will look back at all of this and realize we were trying too hard to understand something that was simply meant to be experienced. Maybe we will laugh at how carefully we analyzed every pause, every sentence, every moment. Maybe we will discover that the answer was never hidden. Maybe it was simply unfolding, slowly, quietly, without permission, without a perfect explanation. And perhaps that is why it feels real, because real things rarely arrive perfectly packaged. They come incomplete, messy, uncertain, human. They ask you to pay attention. They ask you to remain honest. They ask you to accept that you cannot control everything. And maybe that is the lesson I needed. Not how to hold on, not how to let go. How to remain present without demanding an outcome. So I'll stop trying to predict where this goes. I'll stop trying to name every feeling before I understand it. I'll stop pretending that something has to be defined to be real, and I'll let it exist as it is, as it becomes, as we become, because maybe the most important part isn't what you become to me. Maybe it's what your presence has already revealed, that I am capable of recognizing someone without needing to possess them, that I am capable of caring without losing myself, that I am capable of allowing uncertainty without turning it into fear, that I am capable of being seen without immediately disappearing behind another layer. And if that is what this connection gives me, then it has already given me something I didn't know I needed. A different way of being understood, a different way of understanding myself. And maybe that is why I keep returning to the same thought, not because I have no answer, because the answer keeps becoming clearer. You didn't force your way into my life. You didn't demand a place. You didn't convince me. You didn't chase me into understanding. You simply existed with enough honesty that I eventually stopped looking for reasons not to notice. And once I noticed, I couldn't go back. Not because I became dependent on you, because I became aware of something I had never seen before. A connection that didn't need to shout to be significant. A presence that didn't need to demand attention to remain remembered. A person who didn't need to know every part of me to recognize something real, and maybe that is enough. Maybe we don't need to know the ending yet. Maybe we only need to be honest about the present. And right now, the present says this: something changed. I changed. You matter. I noticed. I'm not running from it anymore. And whatever comes next, I want it to be real.